Chapter 7, Invasion. Jor Pasap. Months had passed, and there was hardly any sign of improvement among the group of fighters I joined. The soldiers who enlisted still had difficulty fighting me. The best that most of them could do was parry with me for a few minutes before they fell to the ground, clutching at their sides and groaning in pain as though parrying with me had done them considerable damage. The group still reeked of mediocrity, and I wondered how I could train this lot in such a short time to make them ready. There was news that the Emperor was making new regulations and releasing new policies all over Akea. And to top it all off, I heard about the alliance he formed with the Tree Runners. If he could create a coalition with Hobubs, he probably would have too. Maurice walked towards me, puffing on his cigar. "Tough one to beat," he said. He was referring to the Tree Runners. "I haven't lost hope," I replied. Tree Runners were gentle creatures. If the Emperor was using them against Akeans, I don't think there will be much bloodshed. Maurice seemed thoughtful. His bushy brows were knotted. "Well, that remains to be seen, eh?" In front of us, several soldiers were practicing with their wooden swords. It was such a sorry bunch that at the back of my head, I somehow regretted my decision to enlist. "Put yourself out there. Teach 'em kids how to hold a sword properly." "You meant wield," I corrected him. He chuckled. "No. I meant hold. Look at 'em go. They couldn't even hold 'em swords." I smiled because he was telling the truth. The young leader, Chief Sonat Borababu, strode in front of us, looking annoyed. "We need to talk," he said. Maurice and I exchanged glances before following the young leader, who had begun to walk away from us. To my right, the soldiers' parrying continued. An occasional yelp could be heard every now and then. A moment later, we were inside the leader's tent. Sonat had dark skin, and his arms and legs were as thick as tree trunks. His belly jiggled when he walked. He didn't seem to have knowledge about fighting. I never saw him wield a sword or shoot an arrow. And so, it remained a mystery to me as to how he came to be the leader of this group. Could he move fast, given his physique? What power did he possess to be able to lead this group? He raised his arms as though in surrender. "The Tree Runners are arriving together with the Emperor's men," he said with a touch of nervousness. Maurice and I stood in front of him, waiting for what he would say next, but he remained silent, as though he was waiting for us to speak. "Well?" he asked. "I didn't realize there was a question," Maurice said good-naturedly. "You've been here with us for months already. You've seen what kind of volunteers we have around. None among them was ready to fight. All of them would scamper about, begging not to be killed if any of the Emperor's men got a hold of them. And what would happen to us then? The young men are training day and night and should show some improvement soon." "Improvements? Soon? Bah!" Sonat said, leering. "These men are not ready to fight anyone, let alone the Emperor's men," he said. "How did you know the Tree Runners were on their way here?" I asked. Sonat glanced up at me. His cheeks puffed out as though he was controlling himself from bursting into another tirade. At least some of the volunteers were quick-witted. Some were stationed at the borders of Mount Rikas, and when the day seemed slack, they sometimes visited the town and got their fill of ale. The news could be heard everywhere. The Emperor was moving his men all over Akea like pawns, giving out instructions to capture rebels, suppress rebellions, and the moons only know what will happen if we were found out. Sonat started moving around inside his tent as though in deep thought. He would shoot us a glance from time to time. "We'll be ready," I said. Maurice and Sonat stared at me. Their reactions were so different. Maurice's face held a suppressed grin while Sonat's held a mask of great surprise. "We will move south," I said simply. "We cannot do that," he yelled. "Didn't you hear me say that they are everywhere now? The Emperor is moving everyone around, north and south, east and west. That's leaving us nowhere to hide. We will be massacred. It was a mistake." "Control your temper," I said. "If we are to rely on you as a leader, you must learn to control your temper." Sonat flushed beneath his dark skin. Oh yeah? I've fought battles in the past, and I'm telling you, if not for the calm that I had learned to master, I wouldn't have reached this age, I said. Maurice sat down, and I did the same. Sonnet remained standing and moving about. What do you say we head to the ghost town? I asked. Maurice choked on his words and coughed. Then, he kept licking his dry, cracking lips. He shook his head. I have never argued before with you, my friend. But this one, I don't think, it's not the best way to go now, he said. There are only 3 places I can think of where I believe we would be safe, I said. First, the ghost town because nobody ever goes there since the province was declared dead. Second, we can go to Sinista, I said. Sinista? Sonnet said. He shook his head vehemently. I was avoiding a massacre from the hands of the Emperor's men, but I never said I wanted to swing the axe on this lot's heads, which is what I would practically be doing should we go to Sinista. Sinista used to be where the tree runners lived. If all of them were going all over Akea, then it only means that the place could be taken over by us. I fear you do not know what you are talking about, Maurice said. Sinista is such a sinister place, and the tree runners were what was keeping the area somehow neutral. I say neutral because even with the gentle tree runners, the vileness of the place was not lifted by their presence. There are hubbubs there, Maurice continued. And these men don't stand a chance of surviving there. What's the third place you would suggest? I wondered if it was right to bring it up. Karasthea, I said and waited for what they would say next. Never. Sonnet hissed angrily. What in cratty hubbub's ass were you thinking, sending our men there? I glanced at Maurice, meeting his stare. He seemed to be thinking about it, and after a while, he nodded slowly. It could be a good place, he said. Sonnet stopped, grabbed a chair, and pushed it close beside us before sitting down. His eyebrows were raised as he waited for either Maurice or me to speak. From what I heard, the Emperor banished the former Queen of Akea there, stripping her of her title and handing over the kingdom to Ion Nodo. If the Emperor banished someone somewhere, it means that he had no intention of going there. Sonnet finished. He was nodding speedily. All right, he said. I don't need any more convincing. It seems sound. He stood up again, walking in circles inside the tent. The Queen of Akea? I asked, surprised. No longer a queen, Maurice said. And probably rotting in Karasthea by now. My face flushed, and I could not think. This was not, I couldn't believe it. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. After a moment or two, I said, I hope you had not dismissed the ghost town so soon. While Sinista and Karasthea are 2 viable options, I think that we stand a better chance if we just go to the ghost town. Heck, even I get scared of that place. All eyes were on me. The ghost town is folklore, Maurice said reproachfully. It's just like any other place. It offers us no protection. I racked my brains really quickly. I just couldn't go to Karasthea. Never wanted to before, never wanted all the more now. If there are really ghosts, then we can make them our allies, I said, hoping against hope that Sonnet would buy what I was saying. Maurice smirked. I had not taken you for a fool, Jor. Sonnet, on the other hand, watched me with wide eyes. I'm afraid of ghosts, and I am the commander of the group. So that means that anyone could be afraid of ghosts, he said slowly. Which means that we'll be safe there, right? I said, egging on our leader. For this moment alone, I was thankful that he was the leader. Although later, I would again question his wits and our chances of survival if we continued to have this man as our chief. Maurice shook his head vehemently. No. We're not going there. Sonnet raised a hand, and Maurice quietened. His eyes squinted at Maurice as he kept murmuring to himself, assemble everyone and get them to leave before. He kept muttering to himself as though he was no longer oblivious to our presence. I stole a glance at Maurice. I think we can go now, I said. It seems like the matter has been decided upon. The ghost town? Maurice said helplessly. You really believe that's the best place for us to go? We can go around Akea. Nobody can hold us in one place, but the most important thing is that, for now, we get moving. Otherwise, we will be captured. Maurice stood up, but he shook his head. I still can't believe it. Let's just wait for the official word from him. Then, we headed out. Of all the places I suggested, I didn't want to go to Karasthea. For one, it was full of volcanoes that had not erupted in quite a long while, which could mean two things: the volcanoes were dead, or the volcanoes could erupt any day soon. And now, there's another thing that I didn't know about. Maurice talked about the former Queen of Akea being banished there. How come that news never reached me? I must stick with Maurice more. I wouldn't have suggested Karasthea if I had known about that. I continued walking back to where the soldiers practiced, but this time, I dragged my feet laboriously as though I carried some heavy weight. I couldn't help but think about the former Queen of Akea.
Go and meet Pasap. Tash sat beside me while we waited for Professor Levin to enter the classroom. I had always wondered what it was like to go to school. One could guess that it would be full of excitement as one looked forward to new learnings and acquaintances. Sadly, that was not the case here. Professor Levin was the only remaining professor in the rural school of Torona village. It wasn't only the professors that were lacking. Everywhere I looked, the seats remained empty because there weren't many students that enrolled. There will be more students later, Quila told me as though she read what I was thinking. It is just sad. Nobody wants to go to school anymore. Even the professors or mere substitutes didn't show up. And to think that this was the first day of class, so supposedly, I don't know, it should be fun, right? I asked. It might have been different moon turns ago, but the citizens could still be terrified of the Emperor. Not many roam the grounds alone anymore. You will notice that most people walk around in groups, if not, at least in pairs, Quila said. Aren't you glad you're with me? She teased. Her teasing should supposedly lighten the mood, but it did not. It made me sour because I had ended up stuck with her. I was still angry at Miroe for what he did. But he's still my brother, and I often wondered what had happened to him. No one could harm him, I suppose. It was with this thought that I would find myself calming. At least, I knew he would be all right. If I ever chance upon him, I hoped I would have already forgiven him by that time. Before the class started, several more students came. I found it weird that the students of one class were of different ages. I could understand that about Quila and me because we had not had the chance to study before, and so we must have been included in the lowest grade, but it was just surreal that it seemed as though all the students, regardless of the level, were only in one class. All right, Professor Levin bellowed. He forced a grin as he surveyed us. 11. He said in a discouraged tone. He heaved a deep sigh. This is our first official day in class after the Akene Wine Festival of 2 moon turns happened. Don't be worried. This is just a start. As soon as the parents learned that there were other parents who actually allowed their children to go back to school, then more children will be enrolled. For now, it will just be us. So, he said as he went to the table in front of the classroom and sat on the chair behind it. Get your books, turn to page 88 and... Page 88? I said. Professor Levin looked at me quizzically. Yes? Why do we have to start on page 88? Page 88 tells us about the history of Akea and the provinces that comprise it. This is the... He paused as he eyed me. I flushed. Unless you don't. I shook my head, ashamed. I could feel my face coloring. All right, for the rest of the class, please proceed to read page 88 until 120, Professor Levin said. Then, he glanced back at me and said, Miss Pasap, I said. Miss Pasap, please see me outside, he said. I stood hastily and passed in front of Quila, who had her head buried in the book. When I went outside the door, Professor Levin was watching me. Is it as I thought? He asked. I can't read, Professor, I admitted. I could feel myself blushing even more furiously. I looked around to see if there was anyone near us who could have heard and let out a breath of relief when I saw that we were still alone. I see, he said. What happened? What do you mean what happened? I stammered. Why don't you know how to read? Professor Levin was scrutinizing me. I wanted to make up all kinds of excuses, like how I was always traveling, or tell him the story about how Grandma died, and since then, I had no time to learn something to further my knowledge. Instead, I merely said, I had not been lucky enough to have the opportunity to learn. Professor Levin remained silent. Looking at him this close to me made me realize that he was almost as handsome as Arden. Which is why I'm here, I said. I want to learn as fast as I can, the basics first. Like reading, of course. And then writing. Arithmetic, perhaps, although I could already make use of simple calculations. And of course, I want to learn power toning. My voice broke in uncertainty. All right, he said. It will be a challenge because I never had a student like you before. I usually handle more advanced classes. But anyway, I will provide you with different learning materials. Go back inside and let me get some materials for you. He walked away, and I went back to the classroom. Quila glanced at me as I sat beside her. What did you talk about? A special class. For what? I could feel my cheeks heating up again. Just something. I'll tell you later. Everybody's heads jerked up as the sound of footsteps grew louder. There were loud voices as though there were arguments. Then, above the commotion, rushed footsteps came running towards us, and in came Professor Levin. Class, I hate to say this, but go as quietly as you can, he said quickly, panting. Go home. It's not safe here now. There were palace guards all over, and there were also tree runners around. Tree runners? Hushed voices said almost in unison. I've never seen a tree runner before. Is there really a tree runner? A young boy walked over to me, asking. He looked just about ready to cry. Quila glanced at me. We both knew very well that there were tree runners. We came across them in Sinista, but I shrugged and said, I don't know. The boy came near us. His lips trembled, and his eyes that looked so innocent grew round, probably in fright. Come here, I said. I embraced him and felt the boy settle in my arms. We have to go now, Quila said. I know, I said. Dumb. A woman outside yelled. The boy jerked and loosened from my embrace. He ran towards the woman, yelling, Mama. I watched as they scurried away with a pang of jealousy hitting me solidly and making me wish I had something like that. Come on, Quila said, pulling at my hand. I don't have your twin's power. But I will do my best to protect you. I took her hand and scrambled up and thought that maybe, come to think of it, I might have something like that. Quila Tash. All the students had left by now, but Goami and I were still inside the classroom. We could hear loud voices and thumping footsteps from outside. We need to go now, I said. I really think we should have left a while ago. Goami was staring outside, her face serene, masking her true emotions. She shook her head. I want to wait for Professor Levin. He promised he would give me some materials to study. Do you honestly think he'd still come back after seeing what's happening outside? He's the one who told us to leave. The rumblings from outside the school grew even louder. Men started shouting, and the women were screaming. I grabbed Goami's hand and pulled her away from the window, scurrying to hide behind a bookshelf. I let go of her hand when we got there and peered through the gaps between the shelves. A tall creature with dark, coarse skin that seemed like tree trunks walked into the room. It stood far taller than most men. When the men beat it with a bat, the creature ignored their attacks and just continued walking, obviously oblivious to their provocations. It then pushed a man standing in front of it, flinging him several yards back. The tree runners were really here, Goami said, her voice shaking. Exactly. I said. What were they doing? Another man tried to attack the tree runner, but the latter just shook the man off. This man flew across the classroom, landing on the floor face first. He lay unconscious. I screamed inside my head, but I stopped myself from making any sound. Goami, on the other hand, covered her mouth with her hand. Then, she gripped me tightly and pulled me closer. Let's go, she whispered. We really have to go now. I was already shaking by then. The screaming from outside was getting louder and louder, and I was unsure where exactly to go, but we had to find a way out of all this. I followed Goami, who was already opening the back door. She immediately dashed off, with me following close behind. "Don't look back now," she said. But for the life of me, I did not know why I did turn around. To my horror, I saw the school grounds covered with palace soldiers and tree runners. They were scaring everyone off and destroying school property, for no reason at all. Some citizens were lying on the ground, seemingly lifeless. The fields surrounding the school had turned crimson. A tree runner raised its large arm and swung, hitting an unlucky citizen who had his back on it. He collapsed to the ground, his body spasming before it went completely still. I could hear my heart pounding loudly, and I screamed when a hand grabbed me. "It's me," Goemi said. "Let's go." As though I was doused with cold water, I began running with Goemi. Shrubs and branches hit me, but I did not stop. All I wanted was to get out of that place. Goemi ran back to where we were staying. She only stopped when we got there. She was bent and panting, and I was just as out of breath. "What in the God's names is happening to Akea?" I asked. Goemi was shaking her head, her face flushed. "I don't know. Why would the tree runners and the Emperor's palace guards attack a school? More importantly, why were the tree runners here?" I said. "They were stories from when I was little, and I believe that they were hiding the last great black egg. However, not one of the stories mentioned that they had a temper. From what I know, they were supposed to be a gentle bunch. None of that matters anymore. We must act as we see fit. Do you think we are safe here?" Goemi asked. "If this attack continues, I think it's best we leave sooner. I just wish that Miroe was with us. He can be a burden, but not one person would be able to hurt us if he's with us. I'd rather die." I jolted at her. Earlier I was shaking out of fear, but this time, I was shaking out of anger. "He murdered Arden, or did you forget that?" Sadness swept over Goemi's face. "I know. I will never forget that. But I wish we could use a power strong enough to defend ourselves. If the soldiers were to capture us, there's nothing much that our powers could do against them." When Goemi didn't say anything else after that, I decided to shift the topic. "Do you think we should stay a while longer to see how things go? A few more days, perhaps?" "I don't think we have a few more days," Goemi said. "You saw what happened back there. They came out of nowhere, and they literally smashed everyone that stood in their path. Savages." A cloud of sadness engulfed me, and there was nothing that I wanted more at that moment than to see Arden again. Or go home. "If this was how the world will end, I'd want to go home," I said. "Home? Do you have a home?" I stopped before answering, considering my response carefully. "I did. A long time ago, before I met Arden." "Why would you want to go back there?" I paused for a moment. "I guess I want to see the place I grew up in. If this kind of chaos and uncertainty existed, wouldn't that be how everyone would feel? I mean, even you said that you wished Miroe was here." We remained silent for a while. Goemi stared at me blankly until, at last, she nodded. "All right. There's nowhere I can call home, so wherever you go, I will go with you." There was nothing much to prepare. We hardly had any possessions, and now that we both decided that it was time to go, we could begin the journey right away. "Tomorrow, then?" I asked. Goemi nodded. "I hope the tree runners have not gone to the place you call home yet." "Where is it?" "Caristhea. The home to the volcanoes," I replied, undecided if I should be proud or not. Goemi's mouth hung open. Miroe had always wanted to go there, but I was too afraid the famed volcanoes would erupt, so I decided it wasn't for us. She shrugged. "Oh well, perhaps now is really the best time. The tree runners would be crazy to go there." I hoped she was right.
Ion Noto. The Emperor wanted me to rally in the south, and there were other things that he asked me to do. 3 things, he said. However, I will deliver more than that to him. In doing so, he will remember that even though I had spent some time relaxing in a mare, I could quickly deliver exceptional results to him. My thoughts wandered off to that event in the Kanelan Palace yards moon turns ago when, during a meeting with the Emperor, the generals had to come out of the palace and fight ghosts. Imagine. Ghosts that vanished right before our very eyes attacked us and killed some of the palace guards. And not only that, but the war dogs had also gone crazy and bit some of us. I shook my head as I remembered why we could not go after these ghosts. Gray men. When we were about to go after them, the horses refused to trot. They remained motionless, no matter how hard we kicked at them. The Emperor, though, had a lot on his mind, and this was proof of that. He had not asked me, and perhaps that meant he had not asked anyone to really check about what happened there. And now, without denouncing my responsibility and duty to the Emperor, I believe it would be best to traipse to the ghost town and see what I can find there. Who knows? Maybe something special awaits me there. Jor Pasap. If there was one thing I could praise the rebels I was with, it would be that they could keep quiet when needed. Just like now, as we travel to Ghost Town. A few hours ago, I breathed in terror as we passed by one of the palace guards' camps. They were so quiet that even the slightest creak from twigs breaking could be heard as we slowly made our way away from the camp. The rest of the journey had been quite uneventful. The ghost town, huh? Maurice said. He chewed on some beef jerky as he walked beside me. I decided to ignore his remark. If we're going somewhere, it should be because we will benefit from the journey, he said. I thought survival was the primary objective and that anything else came second? I replied. After all this time, I had become irritable every time Maurice brought up why we were headed to Ghost Town. No one was going to look for us there. There were no Akeans there. Nothing. The place is dead, he retorted. Lucky that the land is fertile. Crops kept growing as though people were tending to the plants. How long before we reach Ghost Town? I asked, trying to change the subject. 2 weeks if we walk, a few days if we ride, but best to be careful about it. We must travel with utmost care. We must remain undetected. I thought you said that the place was dead. Why should we take the utmost care? Well, he began. Take Sinista. Evil creatures live there. I let out a laugh. Sometimes, you puzzle me too much, my friend. You don't believe in ghosts, yet, the evil lurking in Sinista horrified you. I could see Maurice's cheeks glow a red tint. Sonnet remains a mystery to me, Maurice said, studying the soldier in front of the troop. Sonnet was a huge man, with layers of fat dangling on his belly. Riding a horse, his one hand was on the pommel while the other held a beef jerky. He chewed so loudly that I swear I could hear it from where we were. What is his power? I asked. Didn't really bother asking. But look at all these men, Maurice said, gesturing at everyone riding around us. They trust Sonnet. I corrected him. We trust Sonnet. We are also his soldiers, and yet what do we know of him, aside from the fact that he can eat 2 chickens, 3 ducks, and 1 large pineapple all in one go? Maurice and I chuckled. Are we crazy or not? Maurice said, looking at me. Times are crazy. But we? No, I don't think we are, I replied, still laughing. But don't you wonder what he can do? Maurice asked again, squinting. We can always ask him. He would tell us unless he's cratty royalty. He is, Maurice said. What? I said, astounded. That's how we're getting funded? Maurice shrugged. Probably. Does he even know how to fight? I asked. You're being judgmental. Just because he's a huge man doesn't mean he cannot fight. Besides, all the royals, well, at least most of them, are trained from childhood. I'm just unsure if our chief here underwent the same kind of training. At that moment, Sonnet turned around and raised his flabby arm, motioning for all of us to hurry. I woke up to the sound of Sonnet's loud rumbling. The sky was still dark outside. True enough, Sisis was yet to rise. I stood up, running my fingers through my hair as I approached Sonnet's tent. You! Sonnet said to me, pointing his flabby finger upon seeing me. Why did you ask the troop to march to Ghost Town? He said angrily. His face was crimson, and although the air was sharp, sweat rolled freely from his forehead down to his cheeks. I was rooted to the spot. It is a good, Safe place for us, Sonnet, I said. I believe that no one had settled here for a long time. For many moon turns, nobody has ever dared to stay in Ghost Town, even for more than a day. Soldiers or passers-by would complain of the eerie feeling that the place brings, which makes it perfect for. That's not true. Sonnet shouted. I had scouts march ahead, and they've all returned, saying that Ghost Town cannot be penetrated. What do you mean? The horses stopped by the foot of the mountain leading to Ghost Town. No amount of pushing, kicking, or hitting could make the horses move forward. Sonnet's face was red, and his mouth was frothing as it trembled. Maurice soon followed suit and stood beside me. Where were they? Couldn't it be that they were too scared to enter? Maurice offered consolation. How many did you send? 4 of them. They are our strongest. Sonnet said, still fuming. Come here, you nutcases. He yelled at the men, his flabby arm waving in the air, motioning the scouts forward. 4 young men approached us. All eyes were on them now, waiting for the story they would share. It's true, Chief, one of them said. The horses just stopped walking. It was like invisible walls were blocking us. Do you see this bump? And this bruise? He said, pointing to several of his body parts. I was thrown off my horse when it hit the invisible wall. Sonnet leered at us. See? Now why the cratty hubbubs asked, did you even suggest Ghost Town? I wanted to laugh, but I was able to control it. From the corner of my eye, I could see Maurice attempting to do the same, but he was unable to succeed, and instead, he barked up a laugh. What do we do now? Sonnet roared, although I doubt if he really meant for us to hear his words. I stared at Maurice. We were surrounded by young people. We were the only ones approaching our senior years. It meant that there was a high chance that it might do the group some good if we took the lead. Go on, I told Maurice, who nodded as though he understood me. Sonnet, he began. Don't be impatient. My suggestion is that we should rouse the men. He paused and looked around, beaming even, when he saw that everyone had already awakened. And then, we travel together. I believe these 4 soldiers who so bravely cleared the way ahead for us, but the day is young, and it could be that they were already tired. Let us all, as a team, approach Ghost Town together. So that our nerves won't be racked in fear, I said. I tried hard not to laugh, but my face still broke into a huge grin. Sonnet eyed me angrily but said nothing. All right, he said. We will march to Ghost Town together. Once we reach the foot of the mountains and we cannot proceed, I will smash your crazy head onto that invisible wall, cut it off, and send it to the Emperor for his dinner. Maurice smiled when he inched closer to me. I guess we take the lead then? He said. I nodded. Only up to Ghost Town. Sonnet needs our support, and we should give it to him. All right then, he said. Let's take a horse this time. Maurice rode beside me, and together, we went ahead of the group. Right behind us were Sonnet and the throng flanking him. His forehead was sweaty and creased in annoyance. What if the place was barricaded when we get there? Maurice broke the silence. While that could be true, we must still find a way to get inside. While people believe it to be haunted by ghosts, it should not be impenetrable to Akeans. Only to the ones who are afraid of ghosts. Maurice chuckled. I could almost see the huge trees that sprouted like mushrooms at the foot of Mount Recus, which bordered the ghost town from the west. There were loud rumblings from behind as Sonnet's group moved faster forward. We're almost there. Hurry up, Sonnet said. Maurice trotted forward, and I kicked at my horse so that it galloped immediately after him. Behind the 3 of us, I could hear the increasing neighing of the horses as our troop rallied forward, perhaps optimistic of what we could find when we reached the entrance to Ghost Town. Clouds of dust billowed into the air, covering the rebels on foot. I pulled the horse to a stop. Maurice did the same. Sonnet was behind us, his face could not hide his curiosity. He jumped off his mount, and I swear I felt the ground shake a little after he did. I dismounted and walked towards the entryway, which stood just a few yards away from us now. Maurice dismounted and followed us. I tried catching my breath as I reached the entryway. I stepped over the boundary, half expecting myself to be knocked down or thrown away by some magical force, but it did not happen. Instead, I was able to cross the boundary. I turned around and met Sonnet's stare. I shrugged my shoulders. See? There's nothing to it. Come on, I said. Maurice followed me, and we took some steps forward to ensure we could cross the border separating Pryl from Nivedon. What do you reckon those young rebels were talking about? Maurice said. I will attribute it to lack of sleep. My words got caught in my throat as a loud voice yelled. Why can't I cross over there? Sonnet shouted to me, his nostrils flaring, which made him an even more frightful, greasy sight. He was now back on his horse. Give the horse a little nudge. I shouted back. That's what I've been doing. He ranted. Then, Sonnet dismounted again and walked backward to gain traction before running towards the border with all his might. Perhaps he was expecting the invisible wall to be there. There was no invisible barrier, though, and Sonnet lunged forward with such force that he crashed against a tree before dropping to the ground. Maurice rushed over to where he fell and scooped him up. The lad looked a bit disoriented, I tell you. What the cratty hell, just happened? He said, his voice stuttering. Having witnessed what happened, the other rebels kicked at their horses and forced them forward, but none of the bays moved. It's the horses, I said in disbelief. They cannot enter Ghost Town. The rebels reacted almost in unison. Their eyes rounded in disbelief. It can't be. What sorcery is this? One by one, they tried kicking at their horses, and when the horses wouldn't budge, they leapt off from their mounts and walked towards the barrier. Reluctant at first, but once one leg had crossed the boundary, they soon stepped forward with more confidence. That's odd. One of the rebels said. This was greeted with the other rebels' agreement. Maurice and Sonnet were right behind me now. How in the cratty world did that happen? I thought you said that the ghosts weren't real. If they're not real, how do you reckon this happened? Sonnet said, his voice still shaking out of either fear or disorientation. I shook my head. I don't know, I said. And with all the experience that I've had traveling across Akea, I have to say, what just happened, was absurd. I had no answer for it. But we're inside now, Maurice said. We'll be safe here. What about the horses? Sonnet said. We've got to leave them behind. Maybe a few of the lads can look after them, lest we find ourselves without transport. Sonnet was nodding. Let's find the chief ghost, he said. My eyes rolled at this ridiculous suggestion, but when I turned to face Sonnet, I saw Maurice nodding in agreement. This was such a crazy world. Elder Mayandilo. There were too many of them, and my so-called friends, the horses, were difficult to convince that they should not cross the boundaries between Pryl and Nivedon. After much discussion inside my head, the horses finally succumbed to my wishes. They came back like you said they would, I said to the blonde woman beside me. Ever since her husband passed away, she had taken on a more significant role in Nivedon. Laren San Diego eyed the intruders with much curiosity. I can't make out their accent, it seems they have many, she said. That's true. They could be rebels. She nodded slowly. They are not welcome here. If they are rebels, it means that they are fighting against the Emperor, and I don't want any more reason for the Emperor to go against Nivedon. It's already such a surprise that he has not decided to attack us after all that had transpired in the Kanelan Palace courtyard months ago. I tried my best, Laren. I can only talk to the horses and tell them not to enter the province, and they have obliged. However, as you can see, this is not foolproof. We were lucky that the first 4 rebels who came were all on horses and hence, could not cross Nivedon. However, our luck has run out. And now, they're all here. The rebels were beginning to camp just a few miles into Nivedon. They were still at the foot of the mountains. What are we going to do now? Laren said, starting to sound worried. I was confident that the right thing to do was to consult Salvatore, the new chief hunter. I have done all that I can. It's time for the chief hunter to decide on such matters, I said. Laren observed the rebels who were busily setting up camp. Their horses were forced not to enter the boundary, so some rebels were left to camp outside. Let us hope that they put more importance on the horses than the refuge that they seek to find here, I added. Maybe you can talk to the horses again. Ask them to leave, Laren said. I shook my head. I could try, but I don't think I would be able to persuade them to do that. Times are hard, and even the animals prefer to be cared for rather than roam around without any assurance of food and shelter. With their masters, they were properly fed. Laren had become invisible, and she grabbed my hand. Instantly, I became invisible too. We walked to where our own horse was bound. She mounted first, and for an instant, I became visible as her hand slipped from mine. I hoisted myself on the saddle and mounted myself in front of her. Again, I was invisible as she touched my shoulder. I gave the horse a soft kick and rode onward. If any rebel had wandered away from their camps and saw us, he would only be able to see a horse trotting inside the forest. It still took us about half a day to reach the Niven tree houses. By then, it was almost twilight. Only a handful of houses had their windows open, the faint flickering light visible amidst the darkness of the night. Tomorrow? I asked. Laren shook her head as she dismounted, adjusting her skirt before walking briskly towards the town hall. They will still be awake. When we left, they knew there was something of great concern for us to report. I know my uncle. He would not sleep unless he has received word about it. I stifled a yawn and walked after her, but I could no longer match her speed. Too old for that. Laren was right. As we reached the new chief hunter's place, the receiving area was still well lit, and there were some Nivens that he was still talking to. Salvatore stood up and met Laren halfway in the middle of the room. The blonde woman kissed her uncle's cheek before sinking into one of the cushioned chairs. She motioned to me as though leaving it to me to discuss what we had seen. Salvatore turned towards me as he took the other chair. I was parched, so I took a glass of water first, gulping down the entire content before moving to sit right across them. Stay for this one, Salvatore said to the other two Nivens. This concerns the safety of everyone. The rebels have discovered that it was just the horses that couldn't enter Niven, I began. And then, I went on to tell what Elderman and I witnessed. Laren sat still in deep thought, probably trying to figure out what could be done to prevent the rebels from staying. If they're already on their way here, then there's nothing much that we can do for now except do what we have always done to strays. Uncle, it's different this time, Laren immediately cut in. Scaring them off is not going to work because there are too many of them. Several hundred by my estimate, she added. Laren sounded tired, and I could only guess how tired she must have been, staying up late in the night and mourning her husband still. And now, she was worrying over her daughter again. She had asked me once if I knew where Pyper was, and the only thing that I could deduce was that she was probably off to rescue her friends. We cannot let them stay here for too long. Resources are scarce, and sanitation is going to get worse. Besides, how are we going to get around here? He paused. Salvatore looked around the room thoughtfully. While we as a clan are still used to hiding by being invisible, lately, with all the changes that are happening outside, more of us are becoming a little careless and turn ourselves visible even more often than we should. It is too risky to have outsiders here. If the children start to cry, they will still be mistaken for ghosts. Even if it isn't to be planned, the outsiders wouldn't be able to help but think that there really are ghosts here, Laren said. But there have to be more ways to scare them off. There are too many of them. Even if one or two fear ghosts, they would just decide to stick together as a group, Bombay said, the younger one between the two other Nivens who were with us. I agreed. Suffice it to say that even grown men are scared of ghosts sometimes. What must we do then? Salvatore asked. His forehead creased as he pressed his fingers against his temples to massage them. Then, he looked at me sideways, saying, "Can't you do anything more with the horses?" The loss of horses is going to cost any rebel group. They can't expect to rally against anyone, against the Emperor even more so, if they don't have anything to ride on. There was still something I could do, but I decided not to share it with Salvatore. I reminded myself that I would be endangering myself tenfold by using my power on the horses, should anything happen to them. I shook my head. Not at this point, but allow me to think about it. Salvatore's face looked stern and hopeless at the same time. He looked at Laren for a while before shaking his head slowly. In the meantime, let us inform everyone of the ensuing danger in the coming days. Let no one be caught walking around without using their power. The rebels must not deduce that we are not spirits. Otherwise, they will come and destroy everything, Salvatore said. What about allegiance? Laren asked. Sadly, we have not formed an alliance with anyone in the past. If I must remind you, Salvatore said, pointing to me, the only allegiance we have is with the elders. And it would not have happened had none of them proved their loyalty to the clan. I don't expect these rebels to side with us, let alone prove their loyalty to us. There are too many. It would be difficult to send them away. We will see in the next few days. As for now, once they reach Nivedan, we let them be. Do not touch them but scare them in the usual ways we do. Let them believe we are ghosts. Let's leave it at that. And then, if days turn into weeks and weeks into months, we must find another way of driving them away from our land. Salvatore's voice sounded resigned to the fact that we could only do so much. Laren stood up. No sooner had she done so, so did Bombay and the other Niven. Laren will take her rest, but as for you two, spread the word to all Nivens. Let them welcome the day informed and alert, Salvatore said. Salvatore stood up and left the room, walking ahead of us. We must be ready and even more vigilant. There was hardly any rest for me as Sysis soon woke Nivedan. Its bright rays touched the land, and the atmosphere still seemed jolly, as though everyone was unaware of the potential danger that awaited us. Instead of sleeping, Salvatore had a change of mind and called all the Niven elders into a meeting. I had to agree that it was a wise decision. Now, we have several Nivens in several sectors across Nivedan. Whenever a perimeter was crossed, the Niven manning the area would send word to us. This way, we knew when to expect the rebels. Many of us gathered inside the town hall. Breakfast was served, but nobody touched their food. I felt anxious about what the next hours would bring. They're coming in fast. If they don't rest, they will be here before nightfall, Salvatore told the group assembled inside the town hall. There were less than 20 of us. When they enter the 1-mile perimeter, a group of Nivens will scare them off, Laren said. I will be with them. And Elder Mayan, would you like to join us? I nodded in acceptance. Elder Tala is here with us. We can make use of his power. Distantekis will work very well if one of you stands beside him and makes him invisible. I am certain that the intruders would be shaken when that happens, I said. He is way too strong, Salvatore said. If we let him out, he might be able to escape. If he wanted to escape, he would have already, I began. Forgive me, Chief Hunter, but even the fortified dungeons would not be able to hold someone with Elder Tala's power. He can crush boulders without much effort. If he is not showing us any intent to escape, he might be remorseful when Romeo's group brought him here. I don't think the Elder is to be trusted, Romeo said. His hoarse voice was firm as he eyed me warily. We were able to capture him, that is true, but it was so easy that sometimes I wonder if infiltrating our province was his goal all along. You ran after him for days, and your group put up a good fight, Salvatore began. But when we caught him, he was having a bath in the middle of the forest. And when we approached him, he didn't seem to be concerned at all. He is a dangerous man. Dangerous? Romeo spat out at me. You were the one who said that Elder Tala is the Emperor's man. So, even if he has the power to level the mountains surrounding Nivedan, we will let him rot in the dungeon. It doesn't matter if another group of rebels takes over Nivedan. Them, we can fight, but the Emperor is treacherous, and his power is beyond comparison. I apologize to this assembly, but I choose to fight these rebels instead of selling our entire clan to the Emperor's man. Romeo was shaking, and his eyes were still shooting daggers at me, but I did not avoid his gaze. Everyone had gone silent. Please hear me out. Elder Tala is a dangerous man, but it's almost a moon turn now since he was brought here. There has not been any incident that would lead us to believe that he was insincere. He had been sincere when he surrendered to join your group here in Nivedon. Maybe his soul had been tainted by exposure to the Emperor's charm, but Elder Tala is no longer near the Emperor. Perhaps some of the charms had worn off. I'm not certain, but I'm saying that if it comes to protecting this land, wouldn't it do us good to afford the Elder a little trust? I asked. Romeo was still scowling, but he no longer spoke. He turned towards Salvatore, who seemed to be at a loss for words. We could use him as a last resort, Laren said. Do you agree, Chief? Salvatore's jaw hardened, and he cast a look that told me to back off. I did not dare speak as well. As a last resort, Salvatore agreed. Romeo grunted in disagreement but said nothing more. Dead silence filled the air until it was broken by Salvatore. All right, he began. Everybody, onto your respective groups now. Secure your positions. It is time to protect Nivedon. Jor Pasap. Maurice and I had fallen behind the rebel group while Sonnet and his entourage were somewhere in the middle. The goal now was to reach the heart of Nivedon before nightfall. But since none of us had been to Ghost Town before, this proved to be an impossible task. And besides, everyone was still worried about losing their horses. The soldiers stopped, and somebody blew the whistle. It meant that it was time to rest. Enough for the day. It seems safe, Maurice said to me. This ghost town may be the best place for us to hide. We've been traveling all day. Even days before then, and we've yet to bump into a single soul. He chuckled. No jokes intended. I smiled at his odd attempt to jest. This might work, I said. Haven't been here before, so I don't know what to expect. But did you notice that food is scarce? There seem to be very few animals to hunt. I doubt these men would last more than a few months if we just eat fruits and wild vegetables. Root crops at the very least. They will make us full quickly. And plenty of water, I said. We'll just sweat out the water, Maurice said. We need meat. I dropped my cargo on the ground and bent down, releasing the clasp that tied the tent together. Help me with this one, I told Maurice. He walked towards me and, in a few moments, was busily separating the tent flaps from the poles. All around us, the other rebels were doing the same task, but we were one of those who could immediately pitch their tents. I sat on the ground, fishing a cigar from my pocket. Maurice reached over and took my already lit cigar to light his own. In 2 days, we would be able to settle at the center of the ghost town. Once all tents were pitched, we can proceed with training these younglings, Maurice said as he gazed upon the men who were still busily pitching their tents. Nivens used to have tree houses, do you reckon? No way. Maurice said, his voice loud. Then, he shook his head repeatedly before puffing from his cigar. It doesn't matter to me if the Nivens have died moon turns ago. You won't catch me climbing their tree houses. Cratty stupid. His face twisted as though he had tasted something terrible. Well, I just thought that maybe some of the men could take comfort in those tree houses. If we're going to stay here for long, might as well live in decent housing. Take comfort? Decent? Maurice asked, his eyes bulging at me. Are you out of your wits? If you don't want to, you don't have to, I said. Never mind, he said, waving me off. Aren't you tired of talking about such crazy stuff? Maurice stopped talking. We heard some eerie sounds carried by the breeze. Shh, he said. Listen. He paused again. I could not precisely figure out the sounds. Did you hear that? I nodded, straining my ears to listen to the sound. It was like the wind was howling and singing at the same time. It was unnatural. The wind sounded like it was haunted. Maurice was flattening the hair that had stood on his arms. "That is so creepy," he said. "Ghosts are just spirits. They won't be able to hurt us." "Ignore the sound," I said. However, the younglings in front of us looked agitated. Some of them had stopped putting up their tents and were withdrawing to one side of the camp. It was not everyone, though. Some resisted the urge and remained unfazed. But the sound just would not stop. Sonnet yelled, "Ignore the sounds. What are you, cowards? It's just the wind playing tricks, and you're retreating like children. How will you fight the Emperor's men if a breeze scares you?" Even though Sonnet had shouted at the troop, the effect was not immediate. Most men still stood by the sidelines, waiting for the eerie sounds to fade. "Finish setting up the tent and lock yourselves up inside," Maurice yelled. "Once you do that, you'll be safer." I wanted to laugh. I didn't expect Maurice to be so scared of ghosts, too, but if ghosts were his fear, I would not hold that against him. True to his word, Maurice scurried into our tent and closed the gap halfway. His head popped in between the remaining gap, and he asked, "Are you coming in?" I shook my head at him. "Haven't been in contact with ghosts before. I find this quite interesting." "Well, if you change your mind, just come in," he said. His head was already lost inside the tent. In the meantime, some men followed what Maurice did. After a while, more than half of the men were already inside their tents. Sonnet was wandering around, kicking at the shelters randomly in irritation. "Cowards!" he kept shouting. He stopped beside me. "You? Aren't you going inside too? Ghosts might whisper scary things in your ear," he taunted, gesturing. I decided it would be best to ignore him. When Sonnet saw that I remained unfazed, he stopped taunting and stood beside me. "Let us find their leader," he said while looking around the filled tents. I almost choked. For all his talk of being courageous in the face of these ghosts, he was actually considering seeking out the ghosts. I played along. "What do you mean by finding their leader? The ghost leader?" "Yes." His eyes were fixed in every direction as though expecting to see ghosts materialize right in front of him. "If we are to settle here for a long time, we must make peace with the ghosts. I won't have it otherwise. It is no fun hurting this witless band of buffoons here. How will they train if all they do is hide inside their tents?" A loud swoosh reverberated in the air, followed by some eerie rustling as though there were females under attack, sick people dying, and well, it depended on one's imagination and what they would make out of the sounds. Even Chief Sonnet let out a yelp, but he quickly regained composure. He looked me straight in the eye. "I trust you, Jor," he said. "Let us summon the leader of the pack. I'm sure there's someone high-ranking in the spirit world too. We need to come up with some sort of peace treaty or something." The tent where Maurice had opened, and he came out. He did not look any less scared, but at least he had the guts to come out. He always liked discussing strategies. Perhaps, Sonnet's talk about having a treaty with the ghosts interested him enough to momentarily forget his fear. "Come on, Jor," Sonnet insisted. "You don't look scared. You can lead us in the negotiations. We remain in this land, but we will not destroy anything. We will not hurt the spirits. We can also give them gifts and proclaim holy days to commemorate them. What do you say to that?" My face was frozen stiff as I tried so hard not to laugh. Maurice looked about to volunteer, and I guess I wanted to see how he would negotiate with the ghosts. I pointed to him. "Sonnet, I think that our friend Maurice here will do a better job at that." Sonnet turned to face Maurice with raised eyebrows. "Is that so?" "Yes, I can do that," Maurice said haughtily. "And, of course, Jor will come with me." I turned to Sonnet. "And you, Chief? I suspect you would also want to join us?" Sonnet waved his hand to dismiss me. No, he said, shaking his head. "This task is for you. You can do it. Plan already while I retire." He turned his back and walked away. I let out a titter when suddenly the wind howled again, and Sonnet, for all his pretense at bravery, leapt in surprise. It was a low jump, but a jump, nonetheless. The night went by uneventfully while I kept turning in bed. I hardly thought that my imagination made the tents sway so strongly. The wind's howl was so loud that it seemed otherworldly. Maurice, for all his fear of ghosts, passed out as soon as his body hit the ground. He started to snore almost immediately, leaving me disturbed by the sounds both inside and outside the tent. Eventually, sleep came. When I woke up, the sky was bright, but very few soldiers emerged from their tents. Maurice came out of the tent soon after I went out. Maurice recounted the negotiation points we planned to have once we reached the heart of the ghost town. I nodded in agreement with everything that he said. "Questions?" he asked me. I shook my head. He eyed me curiously as though he doubted my response and motioned me to follow him. In about 20 paces, I found myself in front of Sonnet's tent. His tent was bigger than any of the other tents in our troop, almost double the size. "He's still sleeping," came a rough voice. "This can't wait," I said. Sonnet's instructions were to start moving the following day. "Then, so be it. I will tell him that you stopped by." Maurice turned around and started walking away. I had to jog a little bit to catch up to him. "Best left to us," he said. By midday, Maurice and I had already approached what I believed was the heart of the ghost town. Gigantic trees surrounded a clearing, and the town center was, as hard as it was to believe, clean. A few dried leaves were scattered along the corners, but it was just surreal that remnants of what could have been made by natural disasters were nowhere to be found. It was as though the Nivens had lived and that there were indeed no ghosts in town. Maurice, too, was in awe, his mouth agape as though the same thoughts had entered his mind. He turned to me and said, "How do you propose we do it?" I coughed out a laugh because up until now, I thought that it was still just a notion, not something we would actually do. "Stop laughing. If Sonnet hears you laughing, he'll leave you behind," he said. I stopped laughing, not out of fear but out of concern for the troop. "Let's put these down," I said before laying down the goat that I caught along the way. It was bound by ropes on its legs. I still say that's such a waste. Men are starving, and we'll just be leaving these to the ghosts. They won't even be able to take a bite. It doesn't matter. These are offerings we must give them before we start any negotiation. Maurice caught my eye, and he said, "All right. Let's start." He heaved a deep breath and said in a loud voice, "Greetings. I am Maurice Malo, and I represent our chief, Sonnet Borobabu. I am here to seek refuge from this province." Maurice stopped as we waited for any response. "With me is Jor Pasap. We wish to negotiate the terms of our stay in this province with you." He paused. When there was still no response, he continued, 1. We will not destroy the trees. We will ensure that if a tree dies or is destroyed, we will plant 3 to replace it. 2. We will keep the surroundings clean and respect everything in the province, be it insects, fowl, or any living object. 3. We will eat the fruits of trees and vines, anything that we find in this place, but we will not destroy the thing that gave the produce. 4. We will reside, or at least some of us, in the tree houses. Maurice stopped as a gust of wind blew towards us. It could be nothing but knowing that we were talking to ghosts, it made us feel as though there might be something lurking around. Something could be spying on us, wanting to hurt us, or drive us away. I motioned Maurice to continue talking. He gave me a curt nod before proceeding. 5. You will not scare us. The wind blew harder this time, and I thought something slapped me on the back. Maurice grunted, scratching his head as he looked around, making me believe that something unseen could have slapped him too. "Is there anybody out there?" I said. "We want to negotiate with you. We want the terms to be clear. Please. We come in peace." Nothing happened. "We need a settlement. Outside, everybody is worried about what's happening. What are we to do? We can't just allow the Emperor's guards to harass us. We have our principles, and we honor the Emperor's rule. But if you step outside the ghost town, you will see what's happening. There are soldiers deployed everywhere, and the tree runners with them too. Together, they were terrorizing everyone across Akea. It's like the Emperor fears something that could harm his rule. We are rebels. We don't agree with the Emperor. That's why nowhere is safe for us now. We are here to ask that we share this land with you, I shouted to the wind. Nothing stirred. Maurice caught my eye. When there was only silence, we took it to mean that the ghosts were giving us permission to stay. We knelt to honor the ghosts of the land and walked back to where we pitched camp. Then suddenly, a loud voice bellowed out of nowhere. Chills coursed through my spine as the sound permeated the air. Birds hovered above us, an enormous flock flapping their wings wildly and obviously scared. Above us, they circled for a few moments before flying away. The breeze blew all around, and an eerie moan made me want to believe in ghosts at that moment. I turned towards Maurice, who at this time had already turned around to face east. We saw a ghostly female at the spot where we placed the animals as offerings. Her hair was blown by the wind, a pale yellow that scattered and flew back. Her eyes met ours. Her body flickered. My body tensed. But if she were a ghost, then I was sure that the spirit would not be able to hurt me. It was enough to assuage my fear. "Kneel down, Maurice," I said. Maurice's face had gone pale, and his eyes were fixed on the specter. "We do not accept your plea. You are not welcome here. Do not trespass upon Ghost Town." She paused. A blast of air shot down towards us. It was enough to make me want to run away. All around us, I could hear hooves. They were loud as though they were running, trotting faster to ram into us. Then, all the sounds stopped. I looked up, and the ghost's body was still flickering. "When this place was still Nivedan, you were free to enter this province. But what did your kind do? You destroyed Nivedan, killing its people with no mercy. You are a disgrace to the ancestors. You do not deserve to be here, now that this town is the home of the spirits. Go now, I tell you, or suffer death." The ghost's body flickered, and this time, all the animals within the province made a sound. It was crazy. The goats were bleating. The pigs were oinking, cats meowing, dogs barking. Whatever remained of the birds was chirping. The bigger animals were making noise so loud that it was enough to scare anyone alive into hiding. While the noise broke, the ghost and the offering that Maurice and I made vanished into thin air. The cacophony grew louder and louder, until it reached its peak and exploded into dead silence. Sweat poured down my face. I didn't realize that I had been trembling all over until I finally stood up and noticed my knees shaking. Maurice was even worse. He could barely stand up. I reached out to him and pulled him up. His face had drained of color. When we looked back, Sonnet was there. I didn't know what he witnessed when he arrived, but if his open mouth and wide eyes were indications, I would say that he saw enough. "We have to leave," I said. I was surprised that my voice did not shake when I said that. Sonnet and Maurice nodded. We rushed back to the camp at high speed, trying not to scamper too much along the way. Elder Mayandilo. From an outsider's perspective, what I just witnessed could have caused a traumatizing scare. When Laren San Diego appeared in front of the offerings, her hair blowing and her voice coldly ethereal, I had been scared too, even though I knew she wasn't really a ghost. I could only imagine the tremendous fear it imbibed into the hearts of those poor rebels. Laren walked briskly beside me. She was invisible, and held my hand to extend her invisibility. "Thank you for helping out, Elder. If not for the animals' participation, I doubt it would have been so convincing," Laren said. "It was terrifying," I said. "The rebels would surely have a lot to talk about. Now, they know that they have no place here." As we entered the town hall, Laren released her hold on me, and our bodies slowly appeared before us. "Good evening, mistress," said a Nivan to Laren, who nodded her head in acknowledgement. We continued walking until we reached the end of the hall, where the Nivan elders met. I pushed the door open, held it, allowing Laren to pass by me. Then, I walked after her. All heads turned towards us as we took our seats. Salvatore was smiling. We heard, he said. It was grand. Those who witnessed it were all amazed beyond words. They said that had they not been Nivens, they would have scampered away too. Laren dismissed the praise with a curt nod. It still remains to be seen, she said. We must be prepared should they still decide to stay here. Why would they want to stay here after that display? They were afraid, but it is either they were afraid of us or afraid of the Emperor more, Laren said. Let us not discount the help that Elder Mayan provided. All heads turned to me, acknowledging my presence, to which I responded, I have pledged my allegiance. I will not waver in my oath. The animals were my friends, and I can talk to them. When Laren was scaring off the rebels, I provided the special effects. If only Elder Tala had been allowed to join us, I was sure the rebels would have had no second thoughts about it. In the meantime, let us continue to be discreet. Always stay invisible. Inform every household. We are still not entirely safe until we see these rebels out of Nivadan. They might not be strong enough to pose any real threat to us, but just the same, they were the ones who could tell the world about us. Salvatore's voice trailed off. The war generals fought against us right there in the Kanelan Palace yards, I said. The world probably knows about us by now. The rebels were just another set of unnecessary distractions. Salvatore nodded in understanding. He became worried as he turned to Laren. We must be ready when the Emperor sends his men to annihilate us again. We must try to remain hidden, Laren replied. I thought that part of our lives is over now, no more hiding. What we are, the world must know. We have a rich heritage, as Elder Man made us realize more than a moon turn ago. It is not right to hide behind our powers, Salvatore said. Laren's face clouded. She shook her head, a slim hand grazing her face. When she spoke, her voice broke. It isn't what Andoni would have wanted. He prefers the peace that came with keeping our identities secret. He wouldn't call it hiding the way you so bluntly put it, but rather an act to preserve our clan. The other Nivens with us hushed and nodded in agreement. Your husband is not with us, Laren. It is time for a change. Although I must agree that we should only fight when we are threatened and not rally ourselves to attack the Kanelan Palace. Salvatore's voice remained firm, but it had lost the bluntness it carried earlier. Romeo spoke out, I will continue to train the Nivens to fight. I will not leave anyone ignorant of the ways of the sword. When I am done teaching them, no one would wish to cross Nivadan ever again. His face was grim as he stared at Salvatore as though to invite comments from him. However, the new chief hunter did not reply and instead, nodded in agreement. And may I say again that if there is a dire need, perhaps we can begin toying with the idea that Elder Tala may be used to further strengthen our defenses. His power will be of great assistance to us, I said. Romeo glared at me. His jaw hardened, but he did not say anything. It is not our desire to use him to fight for us, Salvatore said. Once an enemy, always an enemy. Any display of action to the contrary is only a betrayal to what his principles really adhere to, which speaks highly of how he will treat us too in the long run, with betrayal. I did not argue after that. Instead, I hoped the Niven's power and mine could stand against the Emperor's attack together.
Pyper, San Diego. It had been weeks since we finally caught up with Mayo, but up until now, there was still no sign of Kino, anywhere. The Kanelan soldiers kept putting up new posters of Mayo, Dogen, Miroe, and Kino's faces anywhere that was still bare. While all this was happening, Mayo, Dogen, and I tried to stay hidden as much as possible in one of the rotting houses squeezed inside the marketplace, which nobody seemed to miss. It played its part by being a safe hiding place for us. For one, it was almost invisible because people were more interested in going to stalls rather than paying attention to a dingy door that the gods only knew what was hidden behind it. And since we were in the middle of the market, food was quite easy to procure. I could almost say that Mayo had gone a bit heavier since we were reunited. Mayo just sat in the corner, squinting at the big book of the Registry of Citizens. There's really nothing here, Mayo said. Nothing about Lamare Amark. Nothing about someone who could do what Kino can do. Nothing that would tell us anything about Kino's power at all. I walked over and sat beside him, peering at the open book in front of us where names were listed pages after pages. If Mistress Lamare's name was not written there, then she must really be royalty. Dogen spoke from the other side of the room. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice a low rumble. "Lamare was a princess, and Kino, because he is her son, is probably the heir to the throne." I gasped. "What? Why didn't you tell me before?" Mayo's eyes were bulging from their sockets. "Because no one would believe me." "Why would anyone believe me? What proof is there?" "Why didn't you tell Elder Man? He would have known what to do with that information," I said. "I wanted to use it as leverage. I would tell him about it once he had more information that he could exchange with us. Besides, no one would believe me. I didn't even believe it myself when I first found out," Dogen said. I paused, wondering about it. "It does seem pretty far-fetched, but I might have considered believing you before. Now, I definitely believe you." "Why?" Dogen asked. "Why do you believe me? Is there any indication that Lamare used to live in the Kanelan Palace? Does she do anything that could lead you to think she could be royalty? If she were, why doesn't she live in the palace? Why did she run away? But then again, even runaways have history, and for the love of gods, Lamare Amark does not have any. How was I supposed to know that anyone would believe it if I had spoken about it?" Dogen's voice rumbled in agitation as though whatever he was saying meant so much to him. "How did you find out?" Mayo asked. He had closed the registry of citizens by now. We were both looking at Dogen, who met our eyes helplessly. "I have always fancied Mistress Lamare," he began. He seemed to be blushing. "She is kind and beautiful, and well, I was just a soldier. I never thought she would become my friend. And then there was this time that we were together in Bulaknin. Every time I looked at her, I was reminded of someone. That someone was a beautiful princess that seemed to have drifted away from existence a long time ago. It was as though the memory of the princess was there, and yet it wasn't. Do you understand what I'm saying? Am I making any sense at all? It was like she was a memory, but I couldn't recall which memory she was a part of. And then, when the Emperor chased us on our way to Nibadin, it was there when I learned that Lamare used to be the Emperor's wife." "Cratty hubbub's ass!" Mayo yelled. He was gripping my hand tightly. "How did that happen? Does it mean that the Emperor was Kino's father? That would explain a lot of things, you know." I squeezed Mayo's hand. "Quiet. Let Dogen finish," I said. Dogen was shaking his head. "I don't know," he said. "Does Kino look like the Emperor? Has he inherited anything from the Emperor? It doesn't seem like that." "I see no likeness between Kino and the Emperor," I said. "And if Kino were the Emperor's son, why would he want Kino dead? It doesn't make any sense. So, I could only be led to believe that Kino's adopted." Mayo yelled. Dogen shook his head. "He's not adopted. I don't think that's it. Otherwise, why would the Emperor feel threatened? It could be that Kino's adopted." Mayo shouted once more. "Quit it, Mayo. Let Dogen finish," I said. "He's not adopted. I don't want to think about it, but there could have been indiscretion here," Dogen said sadly. "Indiscretion?" I asked. "Like an affair?" "I don't want to believe that Mistress Lamare could do such a thing, but that's the only valid explanation I can think of. Ever since I thought Lamare was dead, I have been trying to relive our conversations and everything I've heard about her. I've tried to put two and two together to form something coherent. It seems to me that this is the only explanation. Lamare could have had a child with someone else while she was married to the Emperor. The Emperor banished her to avoid humiliation. And now that he's learned about Kino's whereabouts, he felt threatened, afraid that the child could grow up and usurp him, which was not far from happening because it is actually Kino's birthright. But only if my deductions were correct." I could not take all of it in. Chills kept running down my spine. It was amazing, no, totally nerve-wracking, to learn about Kino's possible heritage and why he was ensnared in all of this. There are many questions. For one, how come no one remembers Mistress Lamare? How come nobody knows who Kino is? How come no one made that connection, the same conclusion you have reached? How come it is only you who knows about it? I asked one after the other. Dogen fell silent for a while before answering. I think that someone else might know. Who? I asked, my interest piqued even more. And how? Dogen met my eye. Do you know the Lady Salarin Douglas? She was always with the Emperor. She acts as his advisor. That night, when Lamare and I were pursued by the Emperor, Salarin was there. And when the Emperor claimed that Lamare used to be his wife, Salarin heard. She seemed to be as surprised as I was. Dogen squinted beyond us as though trying to recall more details. I never really talked about what happened that night when Lamare died because, Dogen said, his voice breaking, it was tough for me. Lamare was important to me, and I wanted to save her from the Emperor. I promised Kino. I promised I would protect his mother, and I failed. In the darkness, Dogen's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I walked over to where he was and sat beside him, leaning against his massive shoulders. I did not realize that I was crying too, until tears fell from my cheeks down to my knees. Salarin knew since then. That makes two of us. However, the rest of the Akeans have no idea who Lamare and Kino were. All they know is that she was the royal scribe and Kino will always be the boy the Emperor wanted dead. Nobody knows the reasons. It's just us, Dogen said. He didn't speak after that. Mayo remained silent too. Occasionally, I heard Mayo hiccuping. A few moments had passed, and I had to say something. What do we do now? I asked. We have to find Kino, Dogen replied. I promised Lamare that I would take care of Kino, and this time, I intend to keep that promise, no matter the cost. I nodded, but deep inside, I was scared. Now that I knew the truth, it made what happened during the Akeen Wine Festival even more terrifying. The Emperor's order to execute Kino was a murderous ploy to ensure that Kino would never be able to take the empire away from him. It did not matter that Kino was just a boy. To the Emperor, any threat to his power had to be quelled. Was I still willing to rescue Kino after learning all this? Maybe I should just go back to Nivedon. Everything was too scary to even imagine. Mayo dried his tears and closed the registry of citizens. He walked over to me and sat beside me. Leaning closer, he whispered, Kino needs us, Pyper. He has no one else, we need to rescue him. I knew then that now was not the time to have second thoughts. We have to rescue Kino even if it is the last thing we do. I hugged Dogen, and Mayo embraced us both. At that moment, even for a little bit, the fear slowly ebbed away.
Kino Amark. The sky was still dark. The boat we were on swayed to and fro as we rode the huge waves. Grandpa was helping steer the ship, and I was told to go inside the cabin for safety. However, I couldn't stay there knowing that Grandpa was out here battling the waves. There must be something I could do to help. Another wave crashed on the boat's deck, bashing a fair amount of water with it. I swayed as the ship hit a bump. I grabbed the pail to gather water from the floor and threw the water out. That's not going to help out, Kino. Northsam, my grandfather yelled. Go inside, so I don't have to worry about you. I wanted to argue, but as another huge wave crashed upon the boat, there were more puddles, and indeed my efforts were futile. I decided to go back inside the cabin and wait there. The boat kept swaying, but a week in the water had familiarized me with the feeling of riding the waves, and now, I did not feel as nauseous as I did before. I sat and wondered what would happen next. As soon as this storm passes, our journey will get easier, and I will be reunited with my friends again. We would then go looking for my mother. After that, we would go into hiding. The Emperor must not catch us. Or. I shook my head. I did not want to face the Emperor or his men. It did not feel right. I realized that the best course for me to take was to hide from the Emperor and run as far away as possible from his men. I did not have to kill him. It matters no more that he wanted to kill me. But in case he catches up with me, that is another story. I would have to defend myself, and if it comes down to choosing between his life or mine, without question, I will choose mine. I must be able to protect myself then. Staying invisible was one way to do it. It was a blessing that I had been in Pyper's company for a while, and because of that, I was able to copy her power for a limited period. Now that I am beginning to understand my power, there have been instances when I could turn invisible even without Pyper around. Recently, I have found a way to keep the last 3 powers I was able to copy. With even more practice, I could manifest these powers, even those I had copied a long time ago. Which made me wonder, could I copy the Emperor's power? I was yards away from him when I was presenting, but was that enough? The Emperor's power was storm crafting, and that meant that this storm, which we are battling now, could so quickly halt if only I could successfully copy the Emperor's power. I smiled as I slowly stood up, edging toward the cabin's door. I pushed the door open, and a wave of cold air blew at my face. I shivered. I kept walking until I reached the deck, holding onto the railings that lined the boat on either side. I closed my eyes and tried to focus. In spite of the storm, with the wind howling and the waves crashing all around me, I tried with all my might to concentrate. It was a tough feat with all the distractions that surrounded me, but eventually, focus settled upon me. I found myself calm, and nothing was inside my head save for a desire to control the wind. At this point, I was devoid of emotions. When I opened my eyes and swayed my arms around, the wind followed my movements. I lifted my hand, flailing wildly before making a throwing motion. The wind redirected its path and left our boat. The boat still swayed but not as hard as before. I met my grandfather's astonished look. I was equally as surprised, but more so, I was beaming. I grinned at him and shouted, "It worked. Grandpa, I stole the Emperor's power. I can command the storm now." Grandpa smiled, and the boatman cheered, so much so that we did not see that wind was blowing back. It roughly crashed against the boat's sails, and I was thrown off balance. I fell on the deck. My face was planted on the planks with water splashing from all sides. I pushed at the floor to stand up, but the boat seemed to have gained speed, and it kept on swaying roughly. The boatmen were shouting all around me. From my back, somebody was helping a man thrown into the water. I stood up, terrified at what I had done. Grandpa and the captain gripped the wheel hard, trying to fight the wind and the waves. I closed my eyes, trembling, and focused on redirecting the wind again. I was able to grasp the wind, but it was difficult to control. It kept lashing all around me like it had its own life until I cried out, letting go of the wind I was trying to control with my mind. The wind bounced back, crashing upon the sail. At the same time, a giant wave crashed against the boat. It hit me, and before I lost consciousness, I heard Grandpa's voice rising over the chaos and calling out my name. The next thing I knew, my torso was wrapped in bandages. Grandpa was sitting inside the cabin. "I was about to wake you," he said. "Where are we?" I asked, trying to feel if the boat was still gliding over the rough waters. "We have docked. About an hour has passed since." I sat up slowly and grimaced as a wave of pain hit me. "Does anything hurt?" I shook my head. I would no longer trouble anyone about the pain that I felt. I wanted to act like a grown-up now. I am out to save my friends. It will dishonor me if I whimper at the slightest pain. "I don't remember what happened," I said. Grandpa was studying me. "Take your time. There's no need to rush now. We have reached the docks of Amare. We will be safe here as long as we don't draw attention to ourselves. Thank you for saving me, Grandpa. When I lost consciousness, I thought that that was the end of me. I didn't know I would have a second chance here." "Not everyone was as lucky, grandson," Grandpa said. His words gave me chills all over. "What do you mean?" "2 boatmen were lost in the storm. One was thrown out when a strong gust of wind rebounded. The other boatman trying to save him was thrown overboard as the boat lurched. No one was able to save the 2, Grandpa said solemnly. "It's my fault. I tried to control the wind to make the storm pass. I shouldn't have done that," I exclaimed as tears welled in my eyes. Grandpa hugged me closer. "It happens sometimes. There can be casualties even when we yearn to do something good. There were unfortunate incidents, I agree. You don't understand. I thought I was doing it so well. I wanted to," I paused. "I wanted to show you that I've progressed in my studies. I could control my power now, so I tried imitating the Emperor's power. I was wrong. Grandpa gave me a solemn look. Having power is new to you. Controlling your power's strength even more so. I do not dare chastise you for what you've done. Sometimes, in our hope of doing something good, we end up doing the opposite. We don't mean to, but it doesn't mean that we won't be able to. Your power is much more powerful than I thought. I gather that this is the first time you tried to copy the Emperor's power, yes? I nodded. You must take precautions. Never play with your power. If you have not used power in the presence of its owner before, do not attempt to use it. Shuffling is strong, but it has to learn the foundations of the power it is trying to copy. If you use power because you only knew it was another's power, you are building up your own rules, dictating how the power should work. In essence, you are working on something you have no idea about. That is very dangerous. Use the power that you have copied in its owner's presence, because only then will shuffling absorb the power's properties and how it must be wielded. Only then will shuffling know how to work the power and keep it in memory so that later on, you can shuffle among the skills that you have copied. Do not despair. Like with everything else, it is a lesson you must learn, Grandpa said. How can I not despair? 2 people died today because of me. All right, he said. Mourn for them, but not for too long. Their deaths should remind you to be more cautious about your power. When this is over, we will search for their families and offer our condolences. Grandpa looked sorry, and I was also sorry. I wished that there was something else I could do. But for now, we must go according to plan. We must find your friends, he said. He stood up and walked towards the door. He glanced back at me. When you are ready, get dressed and follow me. And by ready, I mean that you are ready to search for your friends and move on. I dried my tears as I looked at him from my bed. All right, Kino? He said. I avoided his eyes as a fresh well of tears filled mine. Then, without looking at him, I nodded. I dared not open my mouth because I knew my voice would betray me. The door closed as Grandpa went out. As soon as I was all alone, I let myself cry some more. Grandpa told me to mourn the fallen, so I would, even if that meant only for a few more hours.